So good afternoon, everybody, for all of you who've managed to join the show today. This is News and Booze, organised by Joe. This is me and Julia, who you'll hear from in a moment. We have an amazing guest speaker for you today. Just a couple of words on News and Booze. We get together once a month for the last few months online, previous 3-4 years together face to face, where we have a great, interesting, inspiring, useful, helpful guest speaker along. And we have the opportunity for NGOs, change makers, and others. Now the community is slightly wider, including people from the European institutions and other people, activists committed to the change we all want to see in the world. And so we have been meeting all this time, and today we've reached the point, fast forward 4 years to today, where we've been in lockdown for 4 months. So I hope you're all feeling relatively sane, still productive, still inspired, and we will have an inspiring session for you today. If you want to tweet about it, use the hashtag News and Booze. And do put your questions already in the chat if you have any thoughts or insights or questions as Stefan goes along. I'll pass now the floor to Julia, who will introduce Stefan. So enjoy the show, everybody.
Hi, yes, thanks, Joe. Yes, so I'm Julia. As well as News and Booze, I normally work at the European Network on Debt and Development. So to introduce, and I've realised I've not asked exactly how to pronounce your name, so tell me if this is wrong. Our speaker today is Steffen Thejll-Moller.
Almost.
Thejll-Moller. So we're so sorry about that.
Enough, I've heard all sorts. It's close enough.
Who has been working for the past 15 years with organisations and individuals in Brussels, basically working with people on how to use digital for advocacy, corporate communications, campaigning at large and small agencies, and currently is a partner for Ruud Pedersen in Brussels, in charge of advocacy communications, but also has a huge CV working at some of the biggest organisations there are to work on digital comms. So with no further ado, please add things, Steffen, but I shall hand the floor to you. And we should add that as Steffen goes along with the presentation that's going to happen now for about 15 or 20 minutes, do ask questions in the chat, and then we'll be putting the questions to Steffen, and do say who you are and where you're from when you ask a question. So I'll hand the floor over.
Super, thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. The focus today will be on digital, but mainly in the corporate space and the corporate sort of public affairs space, which is where I've spent most of my time. I'll jump straight into the presentation, given the intro, which, fret not, will be short. The first few times I presented virtually, I basically replicated the same presentation I usually show live online, and realized I bored people senseless. So I've slashed brutally, and we'll try to keep this to about 20 minutes to run through some thoughts and principles, and then we can hopefully do a longish Q&A. But I will start with a short backstory, comparing the state of affairs in digital public affairs when I first got involved, well over a decade ago. Back then, people in public affairs tended to fall into 3 camps concerning digital. Those who thought it was a complete waste of time, not important in public affairs, of course not. Others who thought people like me could fix their computer. Kid you not, first day I joined Fleischmann Hillard, someone asked me to fix their computer. And others who thought it was fairy dust. I'd be invited to meetings and be introduced as a ninja or a guru or other embarrassing terms, and be expected to deliver Obama-like digital strategies which would solve all political and policy issues overnight. Needless to say, I disappointed a fair few people. Fast forward a few years, and we're now, luckily, in a far better place. I think one where most of us appreciate the value of digital, but are realistic about what can be achieved. And most importantly, where the tools and methods that are available to us can help us be far more efficient and impactful across the entire spectrum of public affairs, campaigning, communications, etc. But having said that, yes, we've matured, but I have noted a shift in the debate around digital recently, which I feel represents a bit of backtracking, ironically. Given that we've moved meetings to the virtual realm, much like this meeting, the theory is that, you know, we're magically all digital now. And I'd stress, you know, yes, the fact that we're having meetings online is great, but it doesn't mean that we're suddenly all doing digital. I would really stress that the impact of digital, I think, is far deeper than just replicating offline experiences in the online world. So yes, Zoom is great, but Zoom is not all that digital is. This actually reminds me of a few years ago when Twitter was at its pinnacle, and digital was all about Twitter and social networks generally, Facebook and so forth. Again, super interesting and game-changing and all of that, but social media is not all there is in digital. So it's not all about Twitter or Facebook. So what is it about? I'd urge everyone to think of digital across the board, really, because I think to some extent it affects everything that we do as communicators and campaigners, from intelligence gathering and analysis, understanding our audiences, through to, of course, all aspects of communications, the content formats, the various channels, how we do grassroots, how we do internal, right through to evaluation, testing our messages, determining our impact, determining shifts in perception, and so forth. Digital tools and methods matter across the board. You know, they're not just useful for one bit, they're really useful across the board. So digital transformation, I think, within organizations or functions within organizations should be bigger than just communications. You know, we should be thinking about collaboration platforms and information sharing in a single place, intelligence gathering in a single place, campaign management tools, etc., which does reflect one of the big trends in corporate public affairs when it comes to digital, which is that a lot of organizations are investing quite heavily in tools like Quorum, Fiscal Note, uLobby, that basically allow organizations to just manage everything they do in a single place, on a single digital platform, which has made them all infinitely more efficient, so they claim. And that really, my last point really touches upon this point: operations across the board. Digital isn't just about communications, it's also about enhancing operations. But I won't speak about all of it, given that I promised to keep this short. I will be talking about three things which are pretty big in corporate land at the moment. Beyond corporate, boring corporate content, digital advocacy or grassroots or grass tops, and what I call next generation intel. Starting off with content, experience over message. I sometimes call this slide beyond boring content, because there's lots of boring content around, you know, pointless, vacuous tweets which talk about things like enabling our future or innovating or whatever. We must move beyond boring content. You know, we should be employing proper storytelling practices, and I know that a few of your sessions in the recent past are focused on storytelling. Content should be written by, you know, people who really know how to write it, and channels as well. You know, we often just stop at sort of infographics and talking heads videos. You know, we should be looking far beyond standard channels, and we are by and large. A few years ago, content meant nothing. It was a jargony term. I remember when I first joined Fleischmann-Hillard back in 2009, 2010, people would go, what's content actually? Everyone's talking about it. We don't know what content is. And then we had the big global content boom, as we call it. Everybody started pumping out shed loads of content all of the time, thinking that it was magically going to shift the pin on all policy issues and shape politics. And then we had a few years ago what we call the great content crash. Everyone went, shit, we're spending half our time producing content, and we can't actually prove it's had any impact on anything whatsoever. And maybe we've been wasting our time. But now we're in a better place. We're in a place where we think content can be useful if done well. And what does that mean? Well, it means it shouldn't just be about getting our bloody message out. Often in this market, in Brussels, the market I know best, that's what it is. Content is, digital content is just seen as a series of channels that allows to repeat messages ad nauseum. I think this stems from a belief that a lot of communicators still have, that we just don't get our way because people don't know enough about us, and if they did, they'd love us. Of course, there is some value in pushing messages actively, raising awareness, but we need to see digital and communications generally as much broader than just awareness raising. We shouldn't just be getting our message out. We should be changing behavior. We should be identifying, mobilizing supporters. But yeah, we're not very good at that in corporate land, and we can often be obnoxiously condescending. Hence why the condescending corporate brand page on Facebook and Twitter has plenty of material to keep posting every single day. In all seriousness, though, what we are seeing now is a shift in content towards this sort of structure. Rather than seeking to create shed loads of pointless content all the time and figuring out, what on earth is it that we're going to post tomorrow? The trend is to create longer form content, your long video, your reports, your longer Q&A document, etc., and then repurposing that in a series of short form items, your GIFs, your images, your shorter posts, etc. And then also there's a lot more focus on distribution now than there is on just the content itself. Without a distribution strategy, no one will see your content in the way the social networks work these days. So, by all means, have a smart content strategy, put brilliant content out there. But if you're not thinking about, well, how are people actually going to see this through online advertising, through distributing through, partners in crime or various social channels or email recently, if you're not thinking long and hard about the actual distribution, there's no bloody point creating the content in the first place. But beyond thinking of the formats of the content, we also need to be thinking about what to say to who and when. And what we are seeing now in corporate land, luckily, is that we're tying content to what our overall objective is a lot more. And that overall objective might be initial awareness raising, and it can just be a few thousand people that need to know that we exist. But, we might be beyond awareness raising. We might be focusing more narrowly on just a few hundred people that are extremely influential in policy land, in which case our content changes. It's not about basic initial introductions. It's about deeper understanding. And last but not least, maybe we're at that point in time where actually it doesn't matter. We're not trying to reach a few hundred people who might be influential. We're actually trying to reach our final target audience, the 50 policymakers who will take an action that will determine our fate. In which case, we need to focus our content very narrowly just on that group. And in some instances, maybe online content isn't the way to go, because those 50 people might just be 5 and we have them on speed dial and we'd rather call them than tweet at them. I think in a nutshell, we're just a lot more sort of sensible and targeted in terms of how we focus our content. And part of that is due to the fact that we've got a hell of a lot better at determining what it is that our audiences actually want or need. From determining in detail who it is they actually are, specifically down to a single individual, and understanding, well, how is it that they like to consume content? What is it that they need that we can help them with? What's our existing relationship? Do these people know us yet, or do they need introductions? How formal do we need to be? How do we figure that out? Some elements of online analytics, search, social, perception orders, focus groups, etc. But in this market, in Brussels in particular, which, let's face it, is a small market, a lot of times it's we talk to people who know them, or we talk to them directly and we ask them, what is most useful to you? Again, I do a lot of digital, so everyone assumes that there's a magic digital channel for figuring out everything. But a lot of times, actually, picking up the phone or having a coffee with someone and chatting to them about what their need is, even if that need is delivered digitally, is the best way to go about it. Just a couple of, I spoke to you about the sort of content formats. I just wanted to talk about a couple of trending content formats. We're seeing a lot more podcasts. I'm not going to bang on about this too much, but basically the value of podcasts is they're easier to make than videos, and they're more flexible than video because people can listen to them on the go. So we are seeing a shift, there will be a slow one in corporate land, towards broader use of podcasts. Having said that, creating podcasts isn't actually that easy. It does require a lot of planning or whatever, but in terms of ease of actual production and distribution and ease of listening in, podcasts are great. And also this, you'll all be familiar with Instagram stories and Facebook stories. There's a real shift towards not using your regular feeds, in particular on Facebook and on Instagram, to post stuff, but using the stories feature more. So again, a real trend, a massive trend towards people looking at stories rather than scrolling down their feeds. I wanted to sort of prove this point by, I went onto Instagram just before this and was hoping that I was being targeted by lots of people in this part of town, because I'm just near the European Parliament, but I'm actually being targeted by someone who can fix my tinnitus, by someone who thinks my hair's falling out, and by someone who thinks I play golf. So yeah, I was trying to prove a point here, but sadly, I proved a point that I'm being targeted because I'm in my 40s rather than because I live in policy land. But in any case, the way these tools work is that they can be very targeted, very narrowly targeted, and ordinarily, being near the European Parliament or whatever, I've been seeing policy messages here. Last but not least in this content section, I also wanted to talk about experience. We are seeing a shift from perhaps what social networks used to be all about, which was connections, through to more of this focus on creation, in particular on Instagram, beautiful photos and all of that, through to people actually wanting to be more involved now. And what does that mean, or experiencing things a little bit more? What does that actually mean? Well, in corporate land, apologies for the slightly boring picture, but a lot of times in corporate land, what we really, say we represent an industry which has a really impressive factory somewhere in the middle of Germany that produces amazing stuff. You might have a couple of pictures of it. You might have a description of the cool hybrid cars or whatever. But there's nothing as good as actually touring the plant and speaking to the people there. Can't fly people there, but what can we do? We can create a more virtual experience through 360 video or AR or VR or whatever. Which again, we provide to the people that we're targeting in policy land, and they look at this stuff and they go, well, it feels like I'm really there, and they have a better experience than if we just handed them a bloody, a fact sheet or whatever. Similarly, there is a trend in the healthcare space of pharma companies and patient groups working together to replicate experiences of patients using VR. Which is much more impactful again, than handing someone a fact sheet listing symptoms. I know companies that, for instance, work in migraine, and they've created these VR experiences that allow people to really feel what it's like to have migraines. Obviously, not from the pain perspective, more from the other symptoms. So that's that on content. The next area I wanted to talk about was digital advocacy, or what I call the rise of US-style advocacy. And what I mean by this is using data and digital to identify and mobilize allies and supporters to help organizations do advocacy for them. In corporate land, people are often reluctant to do this, going, oh, but we're in corporate land. But everyone has advocates looking to get engaged, even in fairly contentious industries. And I'd stress in the US, budgets are actually shifting from lobbying to this type of activity to advocacy, because it's more effective to lobby through third parties and real affected constituents than it is through corporate lobbyists, frankly. And it's even becoming critical in the US. A lot of congressmen won't see corporate lobbyists, but they will see advocates who aren't necessarily attached or paid by a single industry. But the case is not that people have to, it's that they should, because this stuff works. And in Brussels, as the issues that are being handled are more and more political, being able to show and harness support from key constituencies is key to success. And again, using data, using digital, we can be really, really smart and targeted around how we do this. But who are these allies and supporters? In some cases, it's really obvious. If you work in the healthcare space, it's patients. In others, perhaps not. But a useful way of breaking it down is into these three categories. It's your grassroots, your affected constituents, grass tops, which you could be experts or people in the public eye, media even, and last but not least, the often neglected employees. Increasingly, organizations are using people their employees who are motivated and excited and proud to help in their advocacy efforts. Now, I haven't got a dozen examples to give you from Brussels, because we sadly don't yet have a mountain of clients who want to do this. It does remain a fairly hard sell. But we do work for one organization called FireSafe Europe, who've adopted a sort of grass top strategy. They've built this community of they're a tiny little organization of 5 people here in Brussels. And they've built a digital community of experts within various facets of fire safety, who are helping them draft a fire safety scheme, which they're hoping will become a European standard. So again, it's not necessarily a case of using them to lobby on their behalf. It's actually going, we don't have enough skills internally to help you put together this standard that we'd like, but by building a community of experts and using online and using community features, they are able to do so. And step 2 of this is using that community of experts to help on actual advocacy. And I'm sure, given the space that you guys work in, quite a few of you do a lot of this type of work, this type of grassroots activation in particular. But just in terms of the process itself, how does it work? It's hardly rocket science. It's really a case of identifying who are our potential allies. Is it a grassroots strategy, grass tops, employee advocacy strategy, and then saying, okay, well, what would incentivize these people to get on board? And then it's identifying a technology provider. We work a bit with someone called Nation Builder, who build websites and just digital infrastructure for political campaigns mainly. They also do a lot of this. And then reach your potential allies, whether it's through your targeted ads or whatever other means. Maybe you have an email list. Maybe you know who the people are. Maybe it's a case of you're partnering up with others who knows everyone. Maybe it's a case of using social media, whatever. And then it's keeping allies informed by email and learning more about these allies and what they might want to do. And last but not least, giving them the training and the means to advocate, lobby, whatever you want to say, when the time is right. And I'd stress, when the time is right. This isn't a case of saying, let's identify a bunch of supporters and give them a bunch of speaking points and let them call a series of decision makers or policy makers. It's not quite that simple. There needs to be some method to the madness, i.e. training people, making sure they're really on board and really keen and really, do believe in the speaking points and so forth. I'll skip to my last point, which is next generation intel. I stressed at the beginning that the beauty of digital to some extent is our ability to gather better intelligence or evaluate things better. And I'd really stress that the amount of clever stuff that we can do using online data is just really impressive. You know, we've got fairly sort of commoditized standard stuff like, you know, intelligence gathering, online monitoring, and so forth. But using AI-enabled methods in particular, you know, we can now do things like predict the positions of politicians, you know, to a T, or predict coalitions of support based on past voting behavior through to public statements, or whatever. And this, you know, this can be done really, you know, at the click of a button virtually. We can also use them to determine public sentiment and likely public responses to policy positions or our own messages, our own positions, you know, by distilling millions of viewpoints rather than just a few. So again, it's, you know, this whole process of intelligence and understanding or predicting political outcomes is far more effective. I won't run through a huge series of tools. I will talk about one tool that we've used a couple of times through a Canadian agency, actually. Basically, what their tool does is it sort of replaces old school polling and focus groups. Now, the issue with polling and focus groups is that you know, you're asking people what they're concerned about. The people often don't know what they're concerned about. And then they're not entirely sure why they're concerned about things. So polling and focus groups, you know, beyond being a bit of a headache to set up, can be fairly unreliable. You know, you're also sort of leading people in a focus group, for instance. You're saying, oh, isn't this thing bad? And everyone in the room says, oh, I think it's terrible. Oh, I think it's even worse. But by using AI, you're actually able to determine people's, God, I hope this doesn't sound sinister, but you're able to determine people's viewpoints and behaviors based on their activities in social media and how they use search engines, and to really understand how these behaviors drive their attitudes. So just, I mean, one example of the sort of things that these we can do with these tools is we just plugged concerns around vaccines, for instance, into their system. Now, what their system does is it first of all, it takes all this data, all this data around personal concerns around vaccines into the system, and then categorizes them based on what's called personalization, which basically means do the individuals actually associate their concern with themselves or a family member? Mobilization, are they willing to mobilize and mobilize against, you know, or for? And severity is here. How concerned are they? Are they highly concerned or not so concerned? And this is fascinating with regards to vaccines, because you know, people who have concerns around vaccines, you know, a lot of people certainly back in September were personally concerned, you know, for themselves or someone in their immediate family, but weren't very likely to mobilize and didn't think it was all that serious. Now, given all that's happened around COVID, of course, that's dropped off as well, and people are actually even, you know, sort of less personally concerned. But what's interesting with this sort of data is that, you know, someone might say, oh, crikey, this would mean that, you know, given the volume of stuff around concerns on vaccines, and given the volume of people who take this personally, you know, what's going to happen? But then if you actually look at the severity or look at the likelihood of mobilizing lines, you can tell, well, actually, these people are probably, you know, they might post stuff on Facebook, but they're unlikely to, you know, call their local legislator or you know, or go on a march against this. So again, just the depth of data that we're able to, or the depth of understanding we're able to glean from AI is just, you know, is a step beyond. And again, I'm not saying it's as simple as you get it from hitting a button, but, you know, not too far off. So that was probably a little bit longer than 20 minutes, but a useful set of thought starters in any case, I hope. And hope you have some questions.
Thank you, Stefan. That's really that was really cool. You whizzed us through. There was quite a lot of different elements to it, but I just had a first question while people gather their thoughts and put questions in the chat. Is in your experience, you've been in Brussels quite a while. You're also working in London, what kind of really sticks out in your mind? Is there like a really great example of somebody doing a good digital campaign, and like a great example of something worked, and one that really was bad? Anything sticking?
I mean, a classic example is Fish Fight. Does everyone remember Fish Fight back in 2012, 2013? So they were going to ban fish discards. Sorry, not ban fish discards. And then a giant campaign ensued, run by lots of organizations in the non-profit sector and some in the for-profit sector, in support of this. And basically what happened in the space of 6 months is that this sort of digitally driven campaign with celebrity endorsers and an online petition and, lots of great content showing poor little fishies dying, actually completely turned the whole issue on its head. And the European Parliament voted in a landslide to ban fish discards. And why I think is so impressive is that this was a case of this wasn't on the agenda, no one gave a damn, and they had 6 months, and they wouldn't have been able to turn this, especially on an issue which is like fish, which isn't quite front of mind. They wouldn't have been able to turn that many parliamentarians without running a digital campaign which got people excited and got hundreds of thousands of people to sign up for petitions, etc., etc. I think that's one. Could I just give another example? Because that's one example of a campaign. There is one single use of of social media in a slightly smaller fashion, which I was, if I'd been presenting live, I probably would have shared it with you. But the Dutch Alzheimer's Association about 4 or 5 years ago ran a campaign on Facebook where basically I'm sure it probably wasn't GDPR compliant, but in any case, they put people into situations that they were never in to basically replicate the experience of having Alzheimer's. So they would team up with these, bars, restaurants, and music festivals or whatever. And on these music festivals, Facebook pages or whatever, you'd have, a politician sort of superimposed onto this, they were supposedly at this music festival. The story being, look, were you ever at this music festival? Crikey, no, I wasn't. Well, that's what it's like to have Alzheimer's. So it's great use of the medium to replicate, a real world experience. Again, the way I've explained it probably makes it sound very trite, but it was, beautiful, because it's, again, the point I was trying to make in the first section is we need to use digital and social rather than just pumping messages. We want to use them to create experiences. And that was a fine example of creating an experience.
Yeah, I remember the fish fight because that was also one of the first. And it was a kind of interesting because it was online campaign, and it had it blended NGOs and celebrity. The chef, Hugh Barton Smith, I think his name is. And it came from nowhere. I mean, like any good campaign, and I'm sure plenty of the people in the room, as it were, today have got great examples from their own organisations or others that they've collected along the way. Because it's always the trick. I mean, how to make an issue like fish discards interesting, relevant, and how to build momentum. So yeah, that was one. And what about a really bad example you just don't want to say in case anybody might be offended?
I mean, I don't want to offend anyone. I will be, I can be, I can speak in general terms. And essentially, I think what does my head in is organizations that do digital purely through the prism of pumping out content and pumping out the same message over and over and over again. It sort of touches upon the point I made before about organizations thinking that simply by leading some mad war of attrition and pumping out a message thousands and thousands of times, people are magically going to change their mind and support said organization. And that's just a really unstrategic way of approaching digital and social media. You know, if you were replicating this in the real world, I mean, would you go to a meeting and say the same thing 100 times, 100 times in a row? No, you wouldn't. You know, you would obviously adapt to the person you were speaking to, know what their point of view was and what their position was, and communicate accordingly. And that's what we need to do in digital and social. You know, we need to understand, you know, who are we mainly speaking to, what are their needs, what are their interests, and how do we adapt?
Yeah, I mean, I've got another question, maybe, and then I'll hand to Julia, which is this interaction between online and offline, like digital, and kind of what's the dance that you, I mean, there's probably several different dances, the waltz or the tango, depending on who you're interfacing with. But how important is that interaction? That it's, as you said, it's not just about, hey, we've got this free tool, we can just pump out loads of stuff regularly every 15 minutes to say the same thing.
Yeah.
What is that interaction? What does it look like in the ideal world for you?
I mean, just to say that I think you don't want anything to be digital only. And I actually removed digital from my job title about 5-6 years ago, just because I felt, it just didn't sit with me, didn't sit right with me, that because, digital only just doesn't make sense from the perspective of, clearly people will see information digitally, but they will also see it elsewhere, and everything needs to be aligned. And also, to the point I was making before, understanding our audiences, we might be delivering communications online, but understanding the best way to understand audiences at an individual level. Sure, we can use mad AI stuff to understand broad sections of opinions, but to understand individual opinions, it's still best to talk to someone. So how does that interplay work? It's that every time we do, what's the common approach to methodology to developing programs and campaigns? It's always intelligence, develop strategy, and then implement. And gathering intelligence and developing your strategy and then implementing, we always do it in an integrated fashion, or we always do it across channels, offline and online.
All right, cool. Julia?
Yes, so I was going to take a couple of questions from the chat. I'm going to give you two questions, different questions at the same time, so we can, if that works. Sure. So the first one is from, neither of these people have put where they're from, but I've just asked them to put it in the chat. If you can, when you ask a question, say where you're from. It really helps us to get a picture. So the first one is Larissa, who says, in policy land, there are now a lot of webinars and Zoom meetings to replace events and in-person meetings we once had. What do you see as new tools or formats for these types of presentations, discussion fora? And that is working in comms for an NGO in Brussels. Mm-hmm. That's Larissa. And then the second question is from Make Barn, who is asking, what's the key for politicians to take note of a campaign? Signatures, clicks, people referring to it in emails to them. So I guess that question is about, in your experience, what has the most impact? Co-founder of the 3 million. That is the speaker. That's the questioner there.
Cool. So I scribbled these down because I have a memory like a sieve. So I would have forgotten the second question. Question number one with regards to Zooms, webinars, and what's sort of new. I mean, I think one thing that I'd stress is the point I tried to make at the start is, Zoom is great and it's fabulous that we're able to do this online or whatever. But yeah, I'm not a fervent believer in all things being digital, and I would rather have been speaking to all of you in person, because clearly what you lack online is the chat beforehand and the chat during afterwards, and actually seeing people properly, which is different. What I have, but assuming this is going to be reality for a while, what I have been seeing. We actually put a proposal together this week for a client that wants to replicate a massive event online. So just doing things through Zoom won't be enough. And we just looked into tools, and we came across one called Hopin, for instance, which is one of many. a new Hopin, spelled Hopin, I think, which was quite interesting in that it tries to replicate a lot more elements of the event experience beyond just presentations. So yes, it's got the breakout rooms like Zoom does, but it's also, and it's got the main presentation bit like this, but it's also got functionality that allows for one-on-one conversations and anyway. So I mean, I won't go through all the features, one, because I can't remember them all, but I think, there is a shift to technology providers understanding that Zoom is great, but doesn't do everything that we need it to do. And so, I would urge anyone who is running large-scale campaigns or events rather, and wants to shift them online to really explore the technology and find what's most apt. There'll be some. You might be pleasantly surprised. The second question: what's key for politicians? I mean, good question. And sorry, I'm gonna adopt that really annoying consultant approach to answering these types of questions and saying it really, it depends. In terms of, I mean, digitally, for instance, I know for sure that I've never come across a parliamentarian or a politician generally who likes to be bombarded by constituents who've all sent the same form or the same letter, so that certainly I wouldn't recommend. Moreover, petitions. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we were all desperately excited about the European Citizens Initiative and what that would bring. Again, I think the impact of petitions has to some extent been watered down because it's so easy to set up a petition on 38 degrees or a Vaz and get loads of people to sign it. So I think petitions done in conjunction with lots of other things can work. But I still think that the digital advocacy piece, which I spoke before, where you're identifying individuals who are keen supporters and allies and can become effective individual advocates towards policymakers, I still think that certainly in the digital realm is the way to go. Across the pond, I think in the US, that's really. I mean, I went to an event in DC the last year just purely on digital advocacy. I mean, 3 days on just digital advocacy, and the stuff was just mind blowing. And I'm hoping that we reach that level of maturity here soon. And I just hope we reach the sort of common agreement that digital advocacy, that's where we need to be going. Using digital and data to do grassroots and grass tops more effectively.
Cool. Thank you, Stefan. I'm just checking if there are other questions in the, I've got another question for you actually, which is about the difference between maybe the European countries. I mean, we've got people, hi George in Berlin, we've got people from all over actually. Lots of different countries. I mean, there's always this, obviously digital carries everywhere, right? So there are no borders for digital, yet we are trying to influence at European level people actually from lots of different countries as well. So how does it work on that basis? If you're really trying to do an effective digital campaign, is it all about the local adaptation, not just translation, but the actual local examples which make it more sense? Or do Brussels bubble campaigns really work, actually? I mean, is it such a micro campaign that we're really just influencing MEPs and commission people and people in Brussels? Or is there such a thing as a pan-European digital campaign, and what does that look like?
I think there is, but it always needs to be localized to some extent. I mean, I think Fish Fight's a good example in that it was, the concept was the same, the message and the ask was the same all over Europe. The visual identity was the same all over Europe, but the celebrity endorsers, for instance, and the examples were different across markets. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned Hugh, long name, in the UK, who is Furling Whittenstall, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, in other markets, they use different chefs, for instance. So no, yes, there is room for a pan-European campaign, but there always needs to be an element of localization. I mean, I remember when I started, and in this line of work, and we just, you remember creating a website here in Brussels and then getting it translated into 15 languages and just having all the same content for every market. And it's just, seemed a bit pointless. So there really is a move towards, smart localization, I think. So there was a second element to your question as well, which I've forgotten, I think.
Yeah, and it's more like the language and the local adaptation, and does that really work to kind of, how do you build that up for a pan-European campaign that has policy influence in Brussels? I mean, partly obviously, as you say, the local, so actually what you're saying is much more efficient to get a country relevant influencer than to translate into the local language. That sounds what you're saying, but maybe there are other elements of, how to bring that to Brussels, or is it just really a question of random joining up the dots online that then somehow lead to Brussels noticing?
I mean, it's all got to tie. I mean, it all needs to tie ultimately to what it is you're trying to achieve. So, assuming that what you're trying to do is influence Brussels, then is it, I mean, I guess what your ask is, even at local level, needs to be tied to that. Who is it in Brussels that's actually going to decide this? Is it going to be, is it going to be MEPs? Is it going to be member states? What we're always hearing here is that, the council member states generally are becoming far more involved and engaged and more important decision makers and are more likely to disagree than perhaps they were in the past. So, to some extent, yes, it might be a Brussels issue, but ultimately what you're trying to do is influence national politicians who will then vote on European issues. So it's a bit of everything. But I mean, with greater politicization, it's because to some extent, even the Commission. I mean, we often call the Commission used to be, a technocrat's wet dream. It's all about bureaucracy and technicalities and expertise and sitting in expert groups and all of that. And now they're also very political because they want to confirm their democratic legitimacy, I suppose, by siding with public sentiment. So to some extent, maybe all of these campaigns also need to target commissioners and commission officials. So yeah, it's all complicated. But I would urge everyone. I'm talking to communicators and campaigners, so I know I'm stating the obvious when I'm saying that it's easy, especially in digital, to go wild and do lots of stuff, but not really tying it to an ultimate objective. Especially in content production, we might pump out lots of stuff on social media, but is it actually helping us achieve our goals? So I'd always just be very, very wary of saying, what is our political or our policy objective, and is what we're doing actually contributing to that? And if there's any doubt, then just ditch it.
Yeah, I mean, the point on timing and sequencing is really important. Depends, what stage of the policy process. If you want to kind of raise an issue like the fish, it's kind of put something on the agenda. If you want to generate support amongst a couple of the member states so they can put it on the agenda of the council. So the sequencing and the timing is all important. Julia, you had, there were some more questions in the chat. Over to you, Julia.
Yes, so I've got one question here from the chat. So this is from Nikki, who's working for Fair Trade NGOs. You mentioned before that you worked with some good tools for identifying public opinion and policymakers likely to vote on specific topics. Do you know of any free tools for NGOs that usually can't afford specialist agencies and software that can be used for this? Also interested in free tools to better identify, segment and target audiences, if you know any of those too. And then I wondered if I could add one question to that. It sort of follows on. In fact, we at the European Network on Debt and Development have just started working with Nation Builder, who you already mentioned, to put all of our tools on one platform. And as you said, this is also a tool which helps to segment audiences and reach out to advocates and so on. But I had a question about, and this is a huge question, but we are we are, like many NGOs in Brussels, a small comms team working with a lot of policy and, a number of policy and advocacy people, both in our office and in our network. Have you got any tips? You get this tool, how to encourage your colleagues to use it too? Because of course, as you said, when you started at Fleshman Hillard, you know, it's a culture that needs to sort of be built in. So I just wondered, when you get a tool like that, if you had any tips on how you really motivate those colleagues who like how they do things already, but do want to do more, to use them. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the first question with regards to free tools, I mean, if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have had a long list. Unfortunately, what these tool providers do is they start providing stuff for free, and then a few years in, they start charging for it once you're hooked. So yeah, there aren't actually that many I can think of. I mean, I would certainly say explore Google's own tools. You know, there's lots of, they provide lots of stuff, you know, be it Google Trends or Google Public Data or Google, you know, Google Analytics for your website, et cetera, which, you know, are actually surprisingly good. I mean, one other thing I would suggest though is that, and perhaps I'm stating the obvious, but I mean, a lot of these tool providers have very different sets of prices depending on the organizations in question. So if you're a big corporate player, they'll charge you a packet, but if you're a very small NGO, they'll charge you a lot less, and it doesn't cost them anything to charge you less because they're an online service. So I know, for instance, that there's a fabulous tool called Tracker, spelt annoyingly TRAACKR, I think, or maybe just KR. Why can't they just spell it the normal way, you ask yourself? But in any case, you know, I know for a fact, so they're an influencer identification tool, a very effective one. And I know for a fact that they have very different price packages depending on the type of organization in question. So yeah, sorry, that's all I have on that, I think. Julia, to your question around internal comms, I have actually advised a few bigger companies who've set up enterprise enterprise systems and have, you know, and no one's adopted them, and so yeah, they've had the same challenge you have, and I think that I just listed the sort of the 4 key success factors usually tend to be, one, having very, very obvious senior buy-in and senior usage. So unless the head of the organization or, you know, people right near the top are using them, no one else will. So, you know, the most senior people in the organization need to be on board. You also need to have sort of champions throughout the organization. So, you know, 2, 3, 4 individuals or more, depending on the size of the individuals, who really you take ownership, really. Take ownership of the platform and promote it internally and use it a lot and figure out what all the functionality is and train people, etc. There's not just a case of setting it up and then hoping people adopt it. You really need these people to champion it. Along that, you have, I think there probably also needs to be a little internal communications plan around the actual tool and tool adoption. You know, if it might just be a monthly missive or a weekly missive about, you know, how the tool is being used and why it's and why it's valuable and how everyone else is using it. Why aren't you? And probably last but not least, maybe an element of gamification. So turn it into a contest. You know, who's using it most effectively, who's posted most, who's depending on the nature of the tool, you know, who's used some of the key functionality with most success.
All right, cool. I've got one more question.
Just a response to that. Thanks very much, Stefan. I remember we did that with social media and it worked very well, that competition thing, but that's very useful. We're in week 2 for us. So
really? Okay, great.
Cool. I got one more question here, and then I think we can wrap up. Maybe Stefan, at the end, after answering this question, you can also give us your like hot tips on the 2 big trends coming up that you see, where the action is, and also like the 3 kind of tips, what people really just the three things they should really take away from this and maybe do a bit differently. The question from Heinrich, which is the first question. So when your business is defending online privacy, you can't use those tools. How to do when your business is defending online privacy and you can't use those often by default privacy invading tools, how do you do this then? So the tools are absolutely great from the point of view of digital marketing, but they aren't a positive thing from privacy perspective. And as Hannah, freelance working in data protection, cybersecurity project, you're totally right, Hannah. There's always this like balance between wanting to do advocacy online and not invading people's privacy in terms of just like overloading them with stuff, or even like entering too much, as you mentioned before, Steffen, into their brains to kind of figure out the analytics. But Steffen, a quick answer to that one, which is obviously a long answer normally, and then maybe you can wrap with your top tips and trends.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, listen, I hear where you're coming from. Obviously, you know, given what you do specifically, and generally, you know, GDPR and all the ramifications of that, you know, it is a bit challenging. So, I mean, I don't really know what to say. I mean, beyond the fact that I do have a lot of clients who do often come to me and say, "Oh, can't possibly do that because of, you know, GDPR. Oh, can't possibly do that because there must be, you know." But I mean, you know, all of this stuff can be done within the realms of legality very easily. You know, otherwise these people would all be out of business. You know, it's the same with, you know, we're all in terms of digital advocacy. I said it's a hard sell in Brussels, and it's largely because people are so concerned. You know, after the Fleischmann-Hillard debacle of a few years ago, people were so concerned about, you know, lists of people. But again, having lists of people who have agreed to be contacted by you isn't illegal. It's just, you know, the type of information you have and what you do with it, and how you store it. So yeah, I mean, I suppose my point is, yeah, I hear you, and I know it's a concern, and everyone needs to be really, really, really bloody careful. But I would also, you know, urge people not to limit themselves out of fear, when you know, in fact, you know, these tools can be very effective. You know, maybe it's just a case of being really upfront and transparent about, you know, how, you know, what exactly you're doing to ensure people's privacy and following all the rules, etc. I mean, in corporate land, that is something that we're seeing increasingly. You know, there's calls for transparency and calls for respect, privacy, etc., etc. And companies just simply, you know, first thing you see when you land on their websites, or, you know, when they send stuff out, is boom, you know, this is what we're doing. You know, it's all out there. Just to finish off in terms of top tips, I mean, I suppose my top tips would be, you know, focused along the lines of the three themes I covered before. You know, one is really content. You know, content is, you know, we have fabulous options with regards to content formats and the channels to push it out, but a lot of content is just rubbish. So I would just, you know, urge everyone to not create too much content, but really focus quite narrowly on creating the right content that you are sure will affect exactly the type of people that you're trying to affect or influence, and you know, and tying it to what it is that you're trying to achieve. Is it shifting someone's opinion? Is it getting them to do something, or is it getting you know, a supporter to sign up, or is to get a policymaker to you know, speak up in Parliament or whatever? So just focusing very, very narrowly on what your objectives are, and also focusing, perhaps not thinking just purely in terms of pushing out a message, but thinking in terms of experiences. You know, depending on what you do, should you be creating content that reflects the experience of the organization, of the people that you know, your closest stakeholders. And I'd also just, you know, stress the whole advocacy piece. Again, I'm sure that a lot of you already do a lot of grassroots work and a lot of advocacy, but really, you know, having a good solid digital infrastructure to help keep oversight and manage that whole process can just make it just immensely impactful. So I'd say one thing not to do. I know everyone's banging on about TikTok these days. I still haven't quite figured out what the hell the TikTok's all about. And maybe I'm showing my age. But yeah, you don't need a TikTok strategy just yet.
That's funny.
Thank you.
That's funny. I think I do have a TikTok strategy, but I won't share that actually. Although that was during the deep confinement, so I think it was kind of, you know, when you have to be creative to survive. Listen, I'd just like to say, Steffen, a really massive thanks. You've shared with us some real inside track on the corporate mindset and action, so we really appreciate that. It's always good to understand how others do things. You've also shared the really great example of the fire safety and how NGOs or small teams can also create great things. So it's not all about the money. Actually, it's all about the right strategy, the smart content approach, as you say, and giving everybody a kind of experience to motivate and engage them, as opposed to just ramming them with that kind of like one-way loudspeaker content. So thank you for stepping outside your work schedule. I know you're busy and you have a young family, so you're keen to get back to them. I'm sorry we can't share booze with you today, but we'll do that another time, as I say. Thanks so much for sharing all of that. I'd just like to say thanks to everybody participating. I can't see you all along the top. Thanks all for being there today, for answering your questions. To my co-founder, co-host, and co-organizer, Julia. And just to say that we're going to have a summer break now with News and Booze, but we will be back in the autumn. I'm not sure if we can even meet again then, but hey, I hope you all have an amazing, if you manage to get a break, have an amazing summer. See all your smiley faces there. Yeah, well-deserved break, and have a digital detox. I think that's the answer, because then you can come back really fresh, strategic, and impactful after the summer. So thanks again, Steffen, Julia, and everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Nice messages.
Bye.
Bye.